In the winter of 1889, a country doctor was handed a telegram, told to pack his instruments, and warned not to write down a single thing he saw. He wrote down everything. His name barely survives in the record now. A few lines in a parish ledger, a signature on a medical license that expired without renewal, a bill for a train fare that someone forgot to destroy. For most of the last century he did not exist at all, and the thing he was called to examine, the thing he was ordered to leave alone, has been explained away so many times by so many careful people that we are supposed to feel foolish for even asking about it. But here is the problem. He measured it anyway. He wrote the numbers down in a hand so small it needed a magnifying glass to read. And those numbers do not match anything we are told about the world as it was supposed to be in 1889. Today we are going to follow that doctor into a cold barn in the middle of nowhere, and we are going to look at what he looked at, not the legend, not the campfire version, the measurements, because once you see the measurements, you cannot unsee the question underneath them. Who decided this was not allowed to be examined? And more importantly, why did they need it gone so badly that they would ruin a respectable man to make it disappear? This is the story of the last doctor who was told not to examine a giant, and what he measured anyway. To understand what happened in that barn, you have to understand the man walking toward it. He was, by every account that we can still find, spectacularly ordinary. He had trained at a provincial college, apprenticed under an older physician, and settled into the kind of rural practice that no one writes books about. He set broken legs. He delivered babies in the middle of the night. He pulled teeth when the nearest dentist was 2 days away by horse. He was the sort of man who kept meticulous notes, not because he expected anyone to read them, but because measuring things was simply how his mind worked. Give him a fever and he would chart it by the hour. Give him a strange rash and he would sketch it, date it, and compare it to 3 cases he had seen a decade earlier. That habit, that quiet compulsion to record, is the only reason we know any of this. If they had sent almost any other man, we would have nothing. But they sent the one doctor in the county who physically could not stop himself from taking notes. And that mistake, that small human mistake in choosing who to trust, is the crack that the whole story leaks through. He was not a believer in anything unusual. This matters, so hold on to it. He did not chase ghost stories. He did not attend the fashionable séances that were sweeping through the drawing rooms of the wealthy in those years. When a neighbour swore the old mill was haunted, he wrote in his journal that the man had been drinking and that the noises were almost certainly the roof settling. He was, in the language of his time, a skeptic and a materialist. He believed the world was made of measurable things. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And that measuring them carefully was the highest form of honesty a person could offer. So when the telegram came, he did not think he was walking into a mystery. He thought he was doing a favour for men who had money and manners, examining something they had found on their land, and coming home in time for supper. He had no idea he was about to spend the rest of his short life being slowly erased. The telegram itself is worth pausing on. We have a copy of it, or at least a copy of a copy, transcribed years later by a relative who did not understand what he was holding. It was short. It requested his presence for a matter of anatomical interest. It mentioned discretion, and it named a fee that was roughly 4 times what a rural doctor earned in a month for a single day of quiet work. 4 times. Think about what that number is really saying. Nobody pays that kind of money for a routine curiosity. You pay that kind of money for silence, and you pay it in advance because you already suspect that once the man sees what you have, he might not want to keep quiet at all. The doctor took the money. Of course he did. He had a family, and he told himself, the way we all tell ourselves, that it was probably nothing, that the wealthy exaggerate, that he would arrive to find some malformed farm animal or a badly preserved skeleton dug up from an old burial ground. He packed his bag. He caught the early train. And somewhere in his notes from that morning, in the margin, He wrote a single line that reads almost like a man reassuring himself. He wrote that the truth is only frightening to those who have something to lose by it. He would learn, before the week was out, exactly how much a man can lose. The journey took most of a day. He changed trains twice, was met at a small station by a driver who would not answer questions, and was taken by covered wagon along roads that got worse the further they went from anything resembling a town. This detail repeats in his account, and it is easy to skip past, so let me slow it down. They did not take him to a museum. They did not take him to a university. They did not take him to a hospital where such a specimen would naturally be studied. They took him away from all of those places, deeper into private land, to a barn that had been emptied and locked and guarded. Now ask yourself the obvious question. If you found something of genuine scientific value, something that would make careers and fill museum halls and put your family name in every newspaper in the country, where would you take it? You would take it to the light. You would summon the experts. You would want witnesses, because witnesses are how discovery becomes glory. Instead, these men did the exact opposite. They took it into the dark. They hired a nobody. They demanded silence and paid for it up front. Every single choice they made was the choice of people who did not want a discovery. They wanted a disposal, and they needed a doctor only to tell them, quietly, what it was they were disposing of. He arrived at dusk. He was fed, briefly, in a farmhouse kitchen by people who would not meet his eyes. And then he was walked across a frozen yard to the barn, where two men stood at the door with the particular stillness of men who have been told to stand there and not think too hard about why. Inside, it was cold enough that his breath hung in the lantern light. There was a long shape on the floor, covered in canvas and packed around with straw and blocks of ice that had been hauled in to slow whatever was happening to it underneath, and standing over it was the man who had sent the telegram. The doctor never names him in the surviving pages. He calls him only the gentleman, always with a small, careful precision, the way you refer to someone whose power you understand and whose anger you fear. The gentleman explained the terms again, in person, in that cold barn, with the covered shape between them. The doctor was to look. He was to determine, to the best of his ability, whether the thing had ever been alive, what it had been, and how old it might be. And then he was to forget he had ever come. He was not to measure it. He was not to draw it. He was not, above all, to write anything down. The doctor agreed to everything. And then, the moment he was left alone with it, he did every single thing he had just been forbidden to do. We need to talk about the covering coming off, because this is the moment the whole story turns on. When the canvas was pulled back, the doctor did not see a monster. That is important. He was not a superstitious man, and he did not describe a monster. He described a body with proportions that were, in his own careful word, human, not a beast, not a fraud stitched together from animal parts, which he specifically checked for and specifically ruled out. A human form lying on its side in the straw, complete and coherent and wrong only in one respect. Its scale. He began, as he always did, by measuring. He had been told not to, and he had no ruler long enough for the job, so he did what a clever man does. He used his own body as the instrument. He knew the exact span of his hand. He knew the length of his forearm to the fraction of an inch, because he had measured it himself years before for exactly this kind of situation, where a proper instrument was not available. And he walked the length of the body with his hands, counting, and then he did it again, and then a third time, because he did not trust the number he was getting. The number he wrote down, when he finally trusted it, described a human body that stood, in life, somewhere close to 12 feet tall. Now, I want to be honest with you, because the whole point of this is honesty. There is a version of this story where I tell you that number and you are supposed to gasp and believe it instantly. I am not going to insult you like that. A 12-foot human being is, by everything modern medicine understands about bone density and heart function and the brutal mathematics of scaling a body up, extremely difficult to explain. The doctor knew this too. He was not a fool and he was not credulous. And that is exactly why what he did next matters so much. He did not just record the height and run. He tried, through a long freezing night, to prove himself wrong. He examined the joints, looking for the signs of the pituitary disorders that produce unusual height in living people, the conditions that were already understood in his era, that caused the bones to thicken and the features to coarsen and the body to suffer. He did not find them. The proportions were wrong for that. In the tall men produced by disease, the body is a normal design stretched past its safe limits, and it shows in the joints, in the spine, in the hands. What he was looking at was not a normal design stretched too far. It was, he wrote, a different design entirely, proportioned correctly for its size, built, if that is the word, to be exactly as large as it was. He measured the hand next, spreading the great fingers against his own spread hand and counting how many times his fit inside the span of one of theirs. He measured the length of the thigh bone through the skin, pressing until he found the knobs of the joint at each end, and the number he got was one that a physician learns to associate with a certain height in a living person, a rule of proportion that holds remarkably steady across all normal human beings. He ran that number through the rule in his head, and the rule gave him back, independently, from the leg alone, almost exactly the same monstrous height he had gotten by walking the whole body with his hands. 2 different methods, 1 answer. That agreement, that quiet mathematical agreement between 2 independent measurements, is the thing a trained man cannot argue himself out of. A single strange reading can be a mistake, but when the hand agrees with the leg, and the leg agrees with the whole, and all of them agree with the skull, you are no longer looking at an error. You are looking at a fact you were forbidden to find. He examined the teeth. Teeth do not lie the way legends do. Teeth wear down according to a lifetime of use, and their wear tells you about diet and age and health in ways that are very hard to fake. He found teeth worn in a pattern that spoke of decades of eating, of a full adult life lived at that scale, not a body that had ballooned briefly and died young from the strain. And he examined the one thing he could not stop coming back to, the thing that he circled 3 times in his notes and underlined once, hard enough to tear the paper, the skull, because the skull, he wrote, was not simply large. It was large in a way that implied room for something. And a physician of his era, standing over a brain case of those dimensions, understood exactly what that room implied, and understood equally that he was not supposed to say it out loud. This is where we have to widen the lens, because this is where the story stops being about one doctor and one barn and starts being about a pattern. Because if this were the only account of its kind, we could file it away as a hoax, a hallucination, or the lie of a man who wanted attention. But it is not the only account, not even close, and the accounts do not come from the fringe. They come, over and over, from the dead centre of respectable 19th century life, from newspapers of record, from land surveys, from the letters of men who had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose by writing them. Across the same decades that our doctor was working, the papers of the era carried a steady, almost bored stream of reports about enormous skeletons pulled from the earth, not sensational tabloids. Ordinary local newspapers, the kind that also reported on grain prices and church socials and who had visited whom for Sunday dinner. A mound opened during the building of a road, and inside, bones of impossible size, a riverbank collapsing in a flood and exposing a row of graves, and the men who lived at that scale laid out in them. A cellar dug for a new house, and something enormous found sleeping in the clay beneath. These reports share a texture that is very hard to fake across so many separate places and so many separate writers. They are matter of fact, they are specific. They give measurements and locations and the names of the men who did the digging. And then, almost always, they end the same way. The bones were taken away. By whom, the reports rarely say. To where, they almost never say. And that, the taking away, is the thread that runs through every single one of them, and it is the thread that ties them back to our doctor in his freezing barn. Something was found, something was measured, and then something, or someone, made sure it went somewhere the public could never follow. And the bodies are only half of it, because if you widen the lens even further, past the graves and the mounds and the men who dug them, you start to notice something about the world these giants were supposedly pulled out of. You start to notice the buildings. Look at the great structures that stood in the cities of that century, the ones we are told were thrown up in a handful of years by men with hand tools and horse carts. The vast exhibition halls. the domed palaces of the world's fairs, built, we are assured, as temporary attractions and then torn down within months. Structures of a scale and a finish and an ambition that we, with all our machines, would hesitate to attempt today. We are told they were disposable. We are told they were raised for a single summer and then demolished, and that no one thought this strange. And the official photographs of those fairs, the ones that survive, show streets that are somehow empty. Immense white cities with no crowds in them, gleaming and finished and inexplicably deserted, as though someone had inherited a metropolis and was hurriedly deciding what story to tell about where it came from. The revisionist reading looks at those buildings and those empty streets and those bodies in the ground and refuses to treat them as separate mysteries. It asks whether they might be pieces of the same one, whether the structures too big and too fine for their supposed builders, and the human beings too large and too old for their supposed era, might both be the leftovers of a world that ended, a civilization that rose and fell before the one we are told is the only one there ever was. And whether the frantic labelling of all of it, the giants as hoaxes and the palaces as temporary attractions, might be the same hand, doing the same work, for the same reason. To take an inheritance that belonged to someone else, and write a deed that says it was ours all along. Here is where the revisionist reading of this whole period earns its place at the table, because the standard story asks us to believe in an enormous coincidence, and coincidences that large deserve to be questioned. The standard story says that all of these finds, every single one, was either a misidentified animal, a deliberate hoax, or an honest mistake by people who did not know what they were looking at. And sometimes, absolutely, that was true. There were hoaxes. There were carved figures buried to be dug up and sold to gullible crowds. Nobody serious denies that. But notice the trick in that explanation. It takes the existence of a few known hoaxes and uses them to dismiss every account at once, including the accounts from trained observers who specifically checked for exactly the kind of fraud they are accused of falling for. It is a very clever move. You find one counterfeit coin, and you use it to declare that all the gold in the vault must be fake. And the people who benefit from that logic are always, without exception, the people who ended up in control of the vault. So let us ask the question that the standard story is built to prevent you from asking. Who was in control of the vault? Who was it, in those exact decades, that had both the authority to send men into locked barns and the reach to make the results vanish, and the motive to want a certain kind of history erased? Because this is not a story about biology, not really. The doctor thought it was, at first. He thought he was solving an anatomical puzzle. He did not understand until later, when the machinery came for him, that he had walked into the middle of something much larger and much colder than a single strange body in the straw. He had walked into an economy that depended on a particular version of the past being the only version anyone was allowed to believe. Think about what the late 19th century was, underneath all the top hats and the steam engines. It was the moment when a handful of institutions were consolidating control over the official story of where humanity came from and how it got here. New museums were being built at tremendous expense. New academic bodies were being chartered, funded by the same industrial fortunes that were, at that very moment, reshaping the entire physical world. And these institutions were not neutral. They had a story to sell. A story of steady, upward progress. A story that began with primitive people scratching in the dirt and climbed, step by patient step, toward the glorious present, which is to say toward the men who were funding the museums. Now imagine what an enormous, anatomically coherent, clearly intelligent human being, pulled from the ground and dated to a time when the official story says there were only savages, does to that narrative. It does not add a footnote. It detonates the foundation. It suggests that before the story we are told, there was another story, a different humanity, at a different scale, that lived and built and thrived and was gone. And if that were allowed to stand, if it were allowed into the museums and the textbooks and the minds of ordinary people, then the entire economic and social order that rested on being the peak of progress would suddenly find itself standing on top of someone else's grave. You do not let that into the museum. You take it into the dark barn. You hire the nobody. You pay for silence in advance. There is a word that comes up again and again in the deeper reading of this era, and the word is reset. Not reset in the small sense of a machine restarting, but reset in the sense of a ledger wiped clean and rewritten in a new hand. The idea is simple and, once you sit with it, genuinely unsettling. It proposes that at some point not nearly as distant as we imagine, a world that had reached a height we would struggle to match was brought low by war or catastrophe or something we do not even have a name for, and that in the confusion and the emptiness that followed, a new order arose that did not so much build a civilization as inherit one, move into the standing buildings, claim the abandoned infrastructure, and then, crucially, rewrite the story of where it all came from, so that the inheritance would look like an achievement and the newcomers would look like the authors of a world they had merely found. If any of that is true, even in part, then the giants in the ground and the palaces on the empty avenues are not two mysteries but one confession. They are the parts of the old world that were too large and too solid to hide, and so instead of hiding them, someone relabeled them. The buildings became temporary attractions thrown up for a summer fair. The bodies became hoaxes and diseased curiosities. And the men who did the relabeling became, in the story they wrote for themselves, the summit of all human progress, rather than what the revisionist reading suspects they truly were. The heirs of a fortune they did not earn, standing in a house they did not build, filing down the nameplate on the door. This is the connection that the deeper reading of this era keeps circling back to, and it is worth stating plainly, even though it will make some people uncomfortable. The suppression of these finds was not superstition, and it was not squeamishness. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It was economics. A specific, ruthless, understandable economics. The value of the new institutions, the fortunes tied to them, the entire architecture of authority that said these men and these bodies were the arbiters of truth, all of it depended on the past being small, primitive, and safely beneath them. A larger past was not just inconvenient, it was insolvent. It threatened to make the whole enterprise worthless, and people protect the value of their holdings. They always have, they always will. Money remembers what it is standing on, and the fortunes of that century were standing on a very specific claim, the claim that the men who held them were the natural summit of a long climb, the ones history had been building toward all along. That claim was not decoration, it was collateral. It justified who owned the land and who owned the factories and who owned the right to say what had happened before. Take away the climb, replace it with a fall. Tell the world that we are not the peak of a rising line, but the scavengers picking through the ruins of something greater, and every fortune resting on that claim loses its story. And a fortune without a story is just a pile of things waiting to be taken by the next man with a better one. So the story had to hold. And holding a story, when the ground keeps coughing up evidence against it, is not a passive thing. It is expensive. It requires museums that display the permitted past and warehouse the forbidden one. It requires academic bodies that fund the safe questions and starve the dangerous ones. It requires 1,000 quiet decisions about what gets examined and what gets taken into the barn. The 19th century did not merely inherit its version of the past. It manufactured it, deliberately, at great cost, the way you manufacture anything you cannot afford to be without. And like anything manufactured at great cost, it was defended. Which brings us back to the barn, and to the long night the doctor spent inside it, filling the margins of a notebook he had promised not to open, with numbers he had promised not to take. By the small hours he had done something remarkable. He had, in effect, performed a full examination in secret, standing over a body he was forbidden to touch, in a barn he was forbidden to describe, using his own hands as his only instrument and his own memory as his only witness. He had recorded height and proportion and the wear of the teeth and the strange completeness of a form that had no business being complete. And he had recorded one more thing, the condition of the remains, because that condition told a story of its own, and it was not the story he had been led to expect. He had been told, vaguely, that the thing was ancient, dug from deep earth, a relic of some unimaginably distant age. But what he was looking at, he wrote, was not ancient in the way he understood ancient things. It was preserved, not fossilized, not turned to stone by the slow patience of geology, but preserved, as though the ground it had lain in had held it the way a cellar holds an apple, cool and dark and slow. And a body preserved rather than fossilized raises a question that is far more disturbing than mere age. It raises the question of when, not the comfortable, distant when of a thing that died before history, a closer when, when that might have overlapped uncomfortably with the edges of our own recorded time. When that would mean this design of human, this larger and different kind, had not vanished in some remote prehistoric dawn, but had been walking the earth far more recently than anyone was permitted to say. That, I think, is the real reason for the ice. Remember the ice, hauled into that barn in the dead of winter, packed around the body to slow it down. You do not need ice for something that has been in the ground for 100,000 years. Ice is for something recent. Ice is for something that is still, in some sense, fresh. The very presence of that ice, a detail the doctor recorded almost without comment, quietly demolishes the story he was told about the thing being unfathomably old. They were not preserving a fossil, they were racing decay, and you only race decay when the clock started ticking recently. He finished near dawn. He covered the body again, exactly as he had found it. He straightened the straw. He put his notebook, that small, dangerous notebook, deep inside his coat against his chest, and he walked back across the frozen yard to tell the gentleman what he had found. And here he made the one mistake that would cost him everything. He told the truth, not all of it. He was not stupid, but he told enough. He said that the remains appeared human. He said they appeared complete. He said, choosing his words with the care of a man who can feel the ground shifting under him, that he could not in good conscience call the thing a fraud, because it showed none of the signs of one. The gentleman listened, and then, very calmly, he asked the doctor whether he had written anything down. There is a version of every person's life that turns on a single sentence, a single moment, where one answer sends everything one way and another answer sends it the other. This was the doctor's. He looked at a powerful man, in a locked barn, on private land, far from any town, with 2 silent guards at the door and a body between them that was not supposed to exist, and he said no. He said he had written nothing. He said he would remember nothing. He took the rest of his fee, and he let himself be driven back to the little station in the grey morning light, and he went home to his family with the notebook still pressed against his chest, holding the only proof in the world that he had just lied to exactly the wrong man. For a few weeks he thought he had gotten away with it. He went back to his practice. He set the broken legs and delivered the babies and pulled the teeth. But he could not leave the notebook alone. At night, after the house was quiet, he took it out and he worked on it. He copied the numbers into cleaner form. He made careful drawings from memory, checking them against his measurements, correcting them, refining them. He was, without quite admitting it to himself, building a case. A case he told himself he would never present. A case that existed only because a man like him physically could not bear to let a measured truth go unrecorded. And then the machinery started to move. It began small, the way these things always do, so small that at first he did not connect the pieces. A patient who had been coming to him for years suddenly took his business to a doctor 2 towns over. Then another. Then a supplier who had always extended him credit, without warning, wanted everything paid immediately and in full. A quiet word, it seemed, had gone around. Nobody said anything to his face. Nobody accused him of anything. That was the genius of it, and the cruelty. There was nothing to fight, because there was no fight, only a slow, deliberate withdrawal of every thread that held his ordinary life together, as though the whole community had been gently instructed to let him fall. He wrote about this in the notebook too, because of course he did. He wrote that he could feel a hand closing around his life but could never quite see the fingers. He wrote that he had begun to understand that the men in the barn had not needed to threaten him or harm him. They simply needed to make him unemployable, unbelievable, and alone, and they had the reach to do all 3 without ever raising their voices. A poor man raving about giants is not a threat. He is a cautionary tale, and they were, patiently and professionally, turning the doctor into a cautionary tale. The medical board came next. A complaint, its source never named, questioning his competence and his character. An inquiry that dragged on for months, that cost him money he no longer had, that ended not with a dramatic ruling but with a quiet suspension of his license on grounds that were vague enough to be unanswerable. He was, on paper, no longer a doctor. The single identity around which his entire life had been built was simply, bureaucratically, taken away. And the beauty of it, from their point of view, was that it looked like nothing. It looked like an ordinary man failing at an ordinary career, with no conspiracy and no giants anywhere in sight, just a physician who lost his practice and his standing the way physicians sometimes do. And notice how modern the method was. They did not need a dungeon or a dagger. They needed only the levers of ordinary economic life, credit and reputation and licensure, the invisible threads that let a respectable man function in the world at all. Pull those threads, quietly, from a height where no one can see your hand, and the man simply comes apart on his own. And everyone who watches it happen concludes that he must have deserved it, because surely the world does not dismantle a good man for no reason. That conclusion, that instinctive faith that ruin must be earned, is the most useful tool the powerful have ever owned. It does their work for them. It turns the crowd into the jailer. The doctor did not lose his life to violence. He lost it to the quiet, universal assumption that a falling man must have jumped. But he still had the notebook. And now, with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, he did the thing they had spent so much effort to prevent. He tried to make it public. He wrote letters. This is the part of the story that the surviving fragments let us follow most closely, because a few of those letters were kept, filed away by recipients who did not know what to make of them and could not quite bring themselves to throw them out. He wrote to newspapers, laying out what he had seen, offering his measurements, offering his drawings, offering to swear to all of it under oath. He wrote to the very institutions that were, unknown to him, the source of his ruin, naively believing that men of science would want to know the truth. He wrote, in the end, to anyone he thought might listen. And the silence that came back was total. Not one of his letters was printed. Not one of the institutions replied with anything more than a form acknowledgement, if they replied at all. His measurements, his careful, honest, hard-won measurements, vanished into filing cabinets and wastebaskets across the country. He was not argued with. He was not debated. He was simply, comprehensively, not heard. And there is no defense against not being heard. You cannot win an argument that the other side refuses to have. That, in the end, is how you erase a man. Not with violence, with silence, applied evenly and everywhere, until the man begins to wonder whether he ever really saw anything at all. He did wonder. The last pages of the notebook are painful to read, even in fragments. He questions himself. He asks whether the cold and the lantern light and the strangeness of the night had tricked him. He asks whether he had wanted so badly to have witnessed something extraordinary that he had built it out of an ordinary malformed skeleton and his own imagination. This is what sustained pressure does to even the most rigorous mind. It does not just take away your reputation. It reaches inside and takes away your certainty about your own memory, your own competence, your own senses. They had not only ruined him, they had very nearly convinced him that he had ruined himself over nothing. But then, in the very last entries, something turns, because he goes back to the numbers. He always goes back to the numbers, and the numbers do not doubt themselves. The numbers do not care that his practice is gone, or that his letters went unanswered, or that his hands shake now in a way they never used to. The height is the height. The proportion is the proportion. The wear on the teeth is exactly what it was. And a man can be made to doubt a memory, but it is very hard to make honest arithmetic lie. In the final legible passage we have, he writes that he does not know who will ever read the pages, if anyone, but that he refuses to let the record die with his reputation. He writes that he measured a thing that the world has decided cannot exist, and that measuring it truly was the last honest act available to him. And then the notebook, as we have it, ends. What happened to him after that, we do not really know. The trail goes cold in the way that lives go cold when someone has taken care to erase them. There is a death recorded a few years later, in reduced circumstances, in a place far from where he had practiced. There is no obituary worth the name. The man who could not stop measuring the world was, at the end, measured out of it entirely, his practice gone, his license gone, his name reduced to those few surviving lines that only mean anything now because we have gone looking for them. And that, on the surface, is where the story is supposed to end, the comfortable ending. The doctor was mistaken, or dishonest, or ill. The giant was a hoax, or an animal, or a trick of the light. The institutions were simply protecting science from a sad and deluded man. Case closed. Move along. But I want to come back to that notebook, and to those numbers, and to the pattern they sit inside, because the comfortable ending asks us to believe something that is, when you look at it directly, far stranger than any giant. It asks us to believe that a trained, skeptical, materialist physician, a man who debunked ghost stories for sport, who specifically checked for fraud and specifically ruled it out, who measured a body 3 separate times because he refused to trust a single reading, was simply wrong, and then ruined his entire life defending a mistake he could have walked away from at any moment simply by agreeing that he had seen nothing. Gan. It asks us to believe that his ruin, arriving with such precision and such reach in the exact weeks after he refused to stay silent, was pure coincidence. And it asks us to believe that the dozens upon dozens of similar reports, from separate places and separate honest witnesses across the same era, all ending in the same quiet removal of the evidence, add up to nothing at all. That is a great deal to believe, and it is worth noticing, always, that the people asking us to believe it are the direct institutional descendants of the very people who took that body into the dark. Here is what the deeper, revisionist reading of this whole period actually proposes, and I want to lay it out clearly so you can weigh it for yourself, rather than simply nodding along. It proposes that the history we are taught is not the history that happened, but the history that was profitable to preserve. It proposes that in the great consolidation of the 19th century, when the modern institutions of authority were being poured like concrete, a decision was made, not in one dramatic meeting but across 1,000 small ones, about which past would be allowed to exist. A small, primitive, upward-climbing past was allowed, because it justified the men at the top. A large, older, stranger past, a past of different humans at different scales, of a world that had risen and fallen before ours, was not allowed, because it made the men at the top into latecomers standing on someone else's ruins. And so that larger past was not disproven, it was defunded, it was declared off limits. Its evidence was taken into the barn, and its witnesses were taken apart, quietly, one unemployable doctor at a time. And our doctor, it turns out, was not even the first. If you go looking, patiently, through the same forgotten boxes and expired licenses and unprinted letters, you find others like him scattered across the decades, each one isolated, each one convinced he was alone. A surveyor who logged a set of graves in his official measurements and found, when the report was filed, that those particular pages had been removed and his careful figures replaced with a blank. A schoolteacher who wrote to a learned society about bones exposed by a landslide near his village, described them precisely, offered to guide any expert to the site, and received in reply only a curt note advising him that the matter had been investigated and closed, though no investigator had ever come. A young museum assistant who catalogued a crate of oversized remains one week and found the crate, and its entry in the ledger, gone the next, and who was advised, when he asked, that curiosity was not a quality valued in a man who wished to keep his position. None of them knew about the doctor. The doctor never knew about them. That is the whole design. Isolate each witness, discredit each one alone, and no single ruined man is ever able to point to another and say, "Look, it happened to him too. We cannot both have imagined the same specific thing." The silence was not one silence. It was 1,000 separate silences, each one arranged so carefully that the people inside them believed they were the only ones who had ever seen anything at all. Only now, more than a century later, with the boxes finally being opened by people who have no career left to lose, do the separate silences begin to line up, and the pattern that each individual man could never see becomes, at this distance, almost impossible to miss. You do not have to accept all of that. I am not asking you to, but I am asking you to notice how neatly the doctor's small, specific, documented ruin fits inside it. He is not a theory. He is a data point. One man, one barn, one night, one notebook. And what happened to him is precisely what the larger reading predicts should happen to anyone who measures the wrong thing and refuses to lie about the number. Consider the economics one more time, because this is the part that the giant, frankly, is almost a distraction from. Forget for a moment whether the body was really 12 feet tall. Set it aside. Ask instead a question that does not depend on believing anything unusual at all. Why would powerful men spend real money, take real risks, and destroy a real career to suppress a mistake? If the doctor had simply been wrong, if the body had been an obvious hoax or a misidentified animal, the response is trivial. You let the experts examine it. They declare it a fraud in an afternoon. The doctor looks foolish. The crowd loses interest, and the whole thing dies of its own silliness within a month. That is what you do with a lie. You expose it, because exposing it costs nothing and ends it forever. You do not do what they did. You do not haul in ice and hire a stranger and demand silence in advance and then, when silence fails, dismantle a man's entire life with surgical care. That level of effort, that expenditure of money and reach and patience, is not what you spend on a lie. It is what you spend on a truth, because a lie destroys itself, but a truth has to be actively held under the water until it stops moving. And the amount of force they used tells you, more clearly than any measurement, which of the two they believed they were dealing with. That is the argument. That is the whole uncomfortable weight of it. Not that we have proof of giants, because a lost notebook and a ruined man are not proof, and I will not pretend otherwise, but that the shape of the suppression is wrong for a lie and exactly right for a truth, and that the same shape repeats again and again across an entire era wherever something too large and too old came out of the ground and threatened to make the official story insolvent. There are, of course, the other explanations, and honesty requires that we give them their due, because a story is only as strong as the objections it can survive. The skeptics point out, correctly, that the 19th century was a golden age of hoaxes, that travelling showmen made fortunes from carved and buried figures, that the public appetite for wonders was enormous and easily exploited. All true. They point out that human memory is unreliable, that a cold night and a strange sight can grow in the retelling, that a man facing the collapse of his career has every reason to invent a grand persecution rather than admit an ordinary failure. Also fair, and they point out, most reasonably of all, that we have no body, we have no bones to test, no skull to measure, nothing that a modern laboratory could examine and settle the matter once and for all. Only words, only a notebook, only numbers written by a man we cannot cross-examine. These are real objections, and I will not wave them away. But notice, again, that every single one of them is a consequence of the very suppression the story describes. We have no body, because the body was taken into the dark. We have only the words of a discredited man, because the discrediting worked. We cannot cross-examine him because he was measured out of existence. The absence of proof is not evidence that nothing happened. In this specific case, the absence of proof is exactly what a successful cover-up looks like from the outside. A perfect erasure leaves no giant. It leaves only a question, and a ruined man, and a notebook that should not still exist. And yet the notebook does still exist, or enough of it does, because of that one small human mistake at the very beginning. They chose the wrong man. They chose the one doctor who could not stop measuring, could not stop recording, could not bring himself to let a true number die unwritten, even when writing it cost him everything. His compulsion was his curse, and it was also, in the end, his revenge. They took his practice, his license, his standing, his name, and very nearly his sanity. But they could not take the numbers, because he had hidden them inside the one thing they never thought to search. A cheap notebook, in the coat of a nobody, carrying the measurements of a thing the world had already decided could not be real. So what do we do with all of this, now, more than a century later, standing at the far end of the erasure they worked so hard to build? I do not think the honest answer is to declare that giants were real and march off certain of it. That would be its own kind of dishonesty, the mirror image of the institutions that declared them impossible and marched off equally certain. The honest answer is smaller and harder and much more useful. It is to hold the question open. To refuse the comfortable ending, not because we know it is false, but because the people offering it have never earned the trust that certainty requires. It is to notice that the story we inherited about our own past was assembled by specific people with specific interests, in a specific moment when a great deal of money and power depended on the past being one particular shape. And it is to grant ourselves permission, at long last, to ask what else went into the barn. Because the doctor's story is not really about a giant. Not at its core. It is about a man who measured something honestly and was destroyed for refusing to unmeasure it. It is about the difference between a lie, which you expose, and a truth, which you have to bury. It is about who gets to decide what counts as real, and what happens to the people who measure their way past the edges of the permitted. And it is about the small, stubborn, almost sacred act of writing the true number down anyway, in a hand so small it needs a magnifying glass, and hiding it against your chest, and carrying it home, so that someone, someday, standing at the far end of the silence, might read it and finally ask the question they went to such lengths to prevent. He measured a thing he was ordered not to touch. He wrote down numbers he was ordered to forget. They took everything he had to make him, and his measurements disappear. And here we are, all this time later, saying them out loud. 12 feet, human proportions, teeth worn by a lifetime, a skull with room in it for a mind, preserved, not fossilized, packed in ice, because it was fresh. Read the numbers. Then look at how hard someone worked to keep them from you. And ask yourself, honestly, which of those two facts is stranger? The measurements of the man, or the price the world was willing to pay to make sure you would never hear them? And if it could be done to him, with that much care and that much reach, over a single body in a single barn, then the obvious and uncomfortable next question is how many other things have been measured honestly and then quietly unmeasured for us, not just giants. Anything, any number, any finding, any inconvenient fact that arrived at the wrong moment and threatened the wrong fortune. The machinery that ruined the doctor was not built for him alone. It was general purpose. It was a method, refined and repeatable, for turning a witness into a cautionary tale and a truth into a silence. And a method like that, once it exists, does not get used only once. It gets used whenever it is needed, on whatever needs it, by whoever happens to own the levers. The doctor is not a curiosity from a distant century. He is a demonstration. He shows you exactly how it is done, and he leaves you to wonder, honestly, how much of what you feel certain about was decided the same way, in a barn you never saw, by men who paid for your certainty in advance. That is not a comfortable thought, and I will not dress it up as one. It is far easier to believe that the past arrived to us clean, that whatever survived by simple accident, that nothing important was ever chosen for us in a room we were never allowed to enter. But the doctor's notebook is a small, stubborn argument against that comfort. It says that at least once, and provably, a true thing was found, measured, and then removed from the world on purpose, and that the man who refused to help remove it was removed along with it. If it happened even once, the comfort is already gone. The only honest question left is how many times it has happened since. The barn is long gone. The land has changed hands more times than anyone can count. The gentleman who sent the telegram died wealthy and respected, his name preserved in exactly the kind of institution the doctor's name was erased to protect. And somewhere, in a box of forgotten papers, in a hand almost too small to read, the numbers are still waiting, still honest, still refusing, after all these years, to say they were anything other than what they were. That is the last thing the doctor left us, not a giant, a number. And the quiet, unbearable question of why a number should ever have been worth a man's entire life to erase.